What follows is free. But if you want to see the full extent of what we do and get involved, go to patreon.com/word in your ear. Now, on with the show.
Okay, well, welcome to another Word in Your Ear. And I've often bored the nation on the subject of the fact that we no longer need a programme on television called Tomorrow's World. What we need is a programme called Yesterday's World. Because what we're also always in danger of forgetting nowadays is what happened the day before yesterday. Now, a valuable corrective to that problem has arrived in the shape of a new book from our old colleague and friend of the pod, Dylan Jones. Faster Than A Cannonball, 1995, and all that, all the way back to 1995. Welcome, Dylan.
Hi there.
Good to see you.
Why 1995? Why did you pick that particular year?
Because it's a kind of peak of the decade. I think that most decades tend to peak about halfway through. But I think that I seem to be in the business of trying to redeem decades, and I felt that it was my turn to do the 90s. And I have to think that if you're going to do something like this, I think you have to be confident and arrogant enough to think that you can add something to the conversation. And where the 90s are concerned, there are lots of very, very, very bad television programs about the 90s. And in my opinion, not that many great books about the 90s. So that was the aspiration anyway.
Right.
I must just ask about the title, because it was obviously that was a kind of widely mocked lyric at the time, but it's ironic and affectionate, isn't it? Why did you choose Faster Than a Cannonball?
Because for that very reason. I remember you sent me an email a couple of months ago identifying that immediately. I mean, it is a comment on the fact that I think people look back upon the 80s through a very particular prism, and actually that's the kind of least interesting one, because it was a very culturally rich period, but I think people look at the very obvious manifestations, and so you're right, it was a slight comment upon that.
Yeah.
So the derivation of the quote, it's Oasis, isn't it? Walking slowly down the hall.
Slowly walking down the hall, faster than a cannonball. Is this a Champagne Supernova? I'm trying to remember.
But I actually don't think that's a terrible lyric, and I think it's a very good description of being on drugs, apparently. But it's not. I wasn't taking issue with the quality of Noel's songwriting, far from it. But I was taking issue with the fact that it's become a kind of catchphrase for that period.
Yeah, no, it has. It's a shorthand.
Your book obviously looks at it's music and a lot more, obviously, isn't it? It kind of starts with music, but you're branching into politics, into the revival in the British art scene and so forth, into media, into men's magazines, all these kind of things. So it's a very broad look, isn't it? What I wanted to start by asking is where's the internet in all this? 1995. Remind us, Dylan, because I genuinely forget when things arrived.
It wasn't until the late 90s, was it, I think?
Well, I don't know. What was happening in 1995 as far as that goes?
One of the things which became very quickly apparent, and if I'm honest, this didn't really occur to me when I started the book, but pretty much everyone I spoke to mentioned this, and I think the reason, one of the fundamental reasons why the decade is so rich culturally and geographically is because it was the last analog decade. You didn't have people shoving a smartphone in your face every 5 minutes. So a lot of those little pockets of culture that start in clubs and pubs and restaurants and universities, etc., they were allowed to sort of ferment because they weren't being mediated through technology. And actually, I think that makes the decade very, very exciting. Plus, I think, to be pretentious about it, I think there was a kind of sense that we were rushing towards the end of the century. Let's get all this stuff finished before we all die.
There's a lovely bit, Noel Gallagher, I think, talking about how the 90s was the last moment of real spontaneity and adventure and experiment and off-the-cuff invention. And I thought that was really interesting, because now people are so worried about career-threatening errors and controversies. Do you think there was just a lot more freedom to experiment and everyone just was more relaxed? Or
In some respects, yes. I mean, I think a lot of this is to do with that was his time, so he celebrates his time. It's like my pop music's better than your pop music. But I do think that's true. But another thing that I certainly think is true, and I think this plays into that, is that it was a big decade for working class culture. And that certainly doesn't seem to be playing out in current times. I think, as I say, I'm the last person to say that things were better back then, but I certainly think there were more opportunities for people.
Do you think, going back to the point you made about little scenes, I mean, can you have little scenes any longer? You know what I mean? That sort of punk rock or new romantics or whatever. These things grew up in little pockets, and then slowly got spread into the media and so forth. Whereas anything that happens nowadays, it's instantly known about, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. I think that it's both, because if you have traction and you are a bold-faced person and you do something in the digital space, just by making one Instagram post, you're seen by a gazillion people, literally. However, you can also look at the way that you can upload something to YouTube or Spotify and literally be invisible. So things have become polarized to such an extent that perhaps those little scenes aren't possible to develop. I mean, look at the way that rock groups happen. Look at the way that rock groups manifest themselves. That doesn't happen anymore, because you either you sort of work away like a mouse or a sort of rodent, and your claws go round and round in the earth, making no effect whatsoever. But if you, like I say, if you are a bold-faced person, have traction, you just press one button and everybody knows what you're doing immediately. So it's like everything else in our culture. They've run to the margins. You're either over here or you're over there.
So, okay, your book starts with Blur at Alexandra Palace, which is a kind of the high point of Britpop. Is obviously a huge thing in your book, isn't it? Why was it so big? Why was it so? Why did it so loom so large in people's memories?
Well, I was keen to, even though Britpop is pivotal to this decade, I wanted to try and avoid using that word and obsessing about that, because that's all people remember about the period. But I think that I don't think it's an original thought to say that one of the fundamental things was that it was a reaction against American music, against grunge, and it was a generational thing. But I think a more interesting element...
And a reaction against 80s and synthesized...
dance music, but I think that had already happened with Acid House. But I think a more interesting element is the fact that a lot of this, particularly in the art world, and there's a lot of art in the book, and I talk to all the principals like Tracey and Damien and Mark Quinn, etc., but it was fundamentally a reaction against Thatcherism. And I think people forget about that, because I think by the early 90s, it's a different thing. All the sort of anti-Thatcher rhetoric was in the early to mid 80s, but it wasn't. And this generation of people who emerged in the kind of creative worlds in the early 90s, they were vehemently anti-Tory. You speak to all the young artists, and it was really a case of, no one's going to help us, so we're going to do it ourselves, and which it is in itself a kind of manifestation of Thatcherism.
So where did that idea of Dave was talking about the Ali Pali concert, and Blur came onto the sound of the Self-Preservation Society, the Italian job, and there's a celebration of this idea of Englishness, isn't there, and of suburbia. Tradition of the Kinks and Squeeze and the Jam.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why there are so many echoes of the 60s, and I write about that. But I try and reclaim that, because again, that's become something of a cliche. But it was a very British thing, and also I think if you look at this through the prism of things like Brexit, it's one of the last times where it was culturally acceptable to celebrate Britishness.
Yeah,
I mean, talk on the pod all the time about you sort of espouse 1950s, 60s black and white British films.
Yeah.
And that was something which you were sort of allowed to do in the 90s. But all that stuff's a bit toxic now, because the pendulum has swung so far away from all of that, because they were sort of core post-war British values.
Do you think what's going on nowadays is a direct reaction to 1995?
I think everything is. But I don't think that it's. I think there's a lot of talk about toxic masculinity, and I think people have a through line back to the 90s because of the huge explosion in men's magazines. I'm not sure that's true. I think that's slightly far-fetched. But obviously, if you look at that period, it was a massive explosion of men suddenly having a new kind of teenage emancipation. And for a while, that was very exciting until it became exactly the opposite.
And now people are very embarrassed about it. It's very rarely mentioned in any documentaries, is it?
It's true. It's true. But actually, if you analyse the first 18 months of Loaded, which principally is what people are talking about, it was a very irreverent, funny, smart, kind of crazy, anarchic magazine. And it was only towards the end of the decade when the sexuality took more precedence. And I think that, as I write about in the book, and as you know better than anyone, that they had such growth, those magazines, that eventually they started to plateau because they couldn't grow anymore.
Yeah.
And the only button that those magazines had to press was the sex button. Yeah. And you can only keep pressing that button so hard before it turns into pornography. Yeah. So not only did the products become slightly icky, but also it coincided with the rise of the internet. So if you wanted that kind of material, you didn't have to buy a magazine to get it. Yeah. So consequently, the whole thing imploded.
I think the other thing, though, which you do mention in the book, I think I'm actually quoted in the book on this subject, is around about the same time as the explosion of lads' magazines, their explosion of young women's magazines doing very much the same kind of thing. Which nobody talks about at all.
Yeah, Minx and things like that.
Well, whatever. No, if you go back and look at a copy of Cosmopolitan from that time.
More, yeah.
You'd find, very similar kind of, there's a kind of brazenness, isn't there? There's a kind of, we're out on the town and we're enjoying it.
Well, I think that's a very good point. And and again, that's something that's kind of written out of the narrative because it doesn't quite fit. But there was another groundswell of very outspoken, as you say, laddish female sexuality, which was incredibly, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, let's talk about football. Because you do talk about football, and obviously this is a classic case of what I mean about the day before yesterday. That we do forget that there was a time when the Premier League didn't exist, kind of thing, and that football wasn't this massive glamorous thing that we live with today. But so what happens in 1995 as far as football's concerned and football stars and the
well, it really happened at the beginning of the decade, and it was a result of Italian 90, which resonated with people through terrestrial television because the England football team were good, and it was a good tournament for England. There was lots of drama. There were more characters involved in football, like Gaza, Gary Lineker, etc., etc. Then you had the launch of Sky BSB, and their success was predicated on the co-opting of football, the creation of the Premiership, and then culturally you had things like
Fever Pitch. Yes, absolutely.
But I do remember going to America in 1994 and watching a lot of coverage of the World Cup on American television, and because soccer was kind of anathema to North Americans, the coverage had to be really carefully explained because it was a game that people didn't understand. And actually, the way that was mediated on American network television was brilliant, because they went they went a long way to explain how things worked, with lots of drop-down boxes and video replays, etc., etc. And a lot of that was copied, not just by Sky, but also by the BBC and ITV. And it was mediating football in a very different way. But it was the creation of the Premiership, and also I think a lot of us have forgotten that Murdoch actually tried to buy Manchester United.
Yes,
there was a lot of money pouring into the Premiership, and all the big outcry now about underhand, suspicious people buying Premiership football clubs. That happened back in the 90s too.
Yeah. So 1990, Italia 90. It's really interesting because Pete Davis wrote that book about Italia 90, didn't he?
All played out.
Fantastic
book.
Really good book. Yeah. Must have come out in 1991. And then when Nick Hornby wrote Fever Pitch, Pete Davis reviewed it in the Times or whatever. I remember reading this review. And this sounds really interesting. A guy's just written about his personal life with football.
Yeah.
And I was doing a program on GLR and I got him in, Nick Hornby and so forth. And you think that's a whole industry nowadays?
Of course it is.
People blokes writing about my life through football.
But also it's blokes identifying themselves in a certain way, and also talking about their emotional lives, which they didn't do before. I mean, it's a whole. Every memoir you read by a bloke now has traces of that, doesn't it? That
and it's all kind of Pete Davis, Nick Hornby, and then it just went wild.
Yeah,
because I think it was also that thing where I was talking about this last night on a telly thing, because now, in some respects, it's legitimate for men to talk about their vulnerability under the auspices of mental health, because you can talk about anything under that umbrella of mental health now.
Yeah.
But back then, you could only admit some kind of vulnerability through your affection for a football team, or the way that particular pop record affected you when you were 14 years old. You know,
absolutely. Yeah. So moving on to another focus in the book is politics, obviously, because so 1995, is that when John Smith dies?
No, he died earlier than that.
Just before,
right.
Again, I think there's often a misconception that somehow this was the brainwave of Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair. And I think the difference is that a lot of this happened under a major government. Obviously, they had no idea what was happening. And it was interesting interviewing John Major for the book, because he very sweetly tried to co-opt it. The fact that all of this amazing, this creative outburst. It's like... But you speak to, I spoke to Tony Blair and to Alistair for the book, and I think they're genuine in what they say, is that they understood what was happening, and they did want to co-opt it, but they wanted to co-opt it by supporting it. And I think that's really interesting, because by the time that they got into power in 1997, it was sort of beginning to dip. It was sort of over. You had and then you had the death of Diana. You had the terrible third Oasis album, and Noel Gallagher reminded me the fourth series of The Far Show, which I'd always forgotten about. So everything began to dip. So all of this energy was very anti-Thatcher, anti-right wing, anti-Tory. And a lot of those people were sympathetic to an incoming Labour government, because they would have been sympathetic to anything that wasn't Tory.
But how also, much do you think their connection is? So I was going to say the Labour Party's connection with an affection for pop culture. How much do you think that shaped their image and helped them get elected in the first place? Because I felt that was really important. I mean, Tony Blair, youngest PM for 180 years or whatever.
I think it's hugely important. I mean, I think it's you, Mark, who talk in the book about the machinations of getting Tony Blair to the Q Awards, and I spoke to I interviewed Alan Edwards, the superstar publicist.
And there's a fantastic thing about Blair writing handwritten letters to Bowie. Tell us about that. It's really interesting.
Yeah. He not only did that because he was, he was he was a star asterisk. He was that Rolling Stones song. He wanted to meet famous people. But a better story, I think, is when Alan Edwards brought Blair to see Bowie perform. I think it was at Wembley Arena, big concert in London. And he said that when politicians usually they came for the green room, the big handshake, they stay for 20 minutes and then get in the car and go for dinner. He said that Blair stayed for the entire concert. And after the concert, he came backstage again. And all the people he'd met before, all the roadies and the makeup artists and the this one, that one, he shook their hand and he'd remembered all their names.
Yes.
That's impressive.
It is really impressive. It's extraordinary. Impressive. Yeah.
No, it's interesting that isn't it, that Alistair Campbell, not interested in pop music at all. No. Just really suspicious of it. Whereas Tony Blair, absolute stars in his eyes when I remember when he came to the Q Awards. He was thrilled.
We introduced him to Ray Davies, didn't we?
Alistair talks about being in the car. I think it's as they're coming away from. It was either the Brits or the Q Awards, and Alistair talks about Blair just saying, "What amazing lives these guys live," and he would have used the word "guys." But when I interviewed Blair last year for the book, he was as enthusiastic about that period and about that music as he was then. So I do think it's genuine. Why wouldn't it be genuine? He comes from a generation of people who loved pop music, and also pop music was new at the time, and it was changing the way people lived their lives.
Yeah.
We should ask about the misconception, really, that the 80s was the big boom time when all the money was made.
Yeah.
But actually, it was really the 90s, wasn't it? The 90s was when the huge profits from CDs.
It's almost 10 years later.
Yeah.
The things that people think happened in the 60s happened in the 70s.
Yeah.
The things that the 80s excess happened in the early 90s, certainly as far as the music business was.
Because I remember that. I remember, CDs were £15. They cost whatever it was, £1 to manufacture, and the huge profits. All that marketing money, all that advertising that could be put into. I mean, it contributed, really, didn't it, to a golden age in magazines and TV. All the advertising.
Yeah, because all of these magazines, all of these lifestyle magazines were created in order to cater for that demographic. As you say, who were pouring a huge amount of money into an industry which was redistributing it. I mean, they were keeping a lot for themselves. But look, the markup on a CD was extraordinary. And after a while, DVD. People stopped bleating about it and just paid for CDs.
Yeah. But that markup paid for a lot of people's wages.
Yeah.
A lot of people driving vans, a lot of people working in stores.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Working in the factories or whatever. They're not doing that anymore.
But don't you remember? I remember walking the secret hour. The hour that no one knew about, and you could wander into a mega store in Oxford Street, and those stores they had their own postcodes. They were so big.
Yeah,
you wander around for hours. Books, CDs, T-shirts, DVDs, all of this stuff, and it was a very small version of the internet.
Right.
Another thing I'd forgotten was that this was the decade of the kind of deification of the Beatles. Before, because it was the red and blue albums on CD, wasn't it? It was anthology. And before that, actually, the Beatles, we always think they were up there on this plateau. But they weren't, were they?
Well,
reinvented by Britpop, partly.
No, I write about the fact that it really was with anthology where it was the return of the Beatles, because before then, in the 70s and the 80s, when they put out those awful records like Live at the Hollywood Bowl or the Love Song albums, and their equity was quite low. And you think that all of this excitement happened with Get Back. But if you all started with anthology, and then they started taking a lot more care with what they were releasing. And so you had things when Let It Be Naked came out, or Yellow Submarine, or Love. All of these things were done very carefully with a lot of money and a lot of care and attention. But also culturally, yeah, I think it was the attention of those stars who had become successful in the 90s, who had enormous affection for the Beatles. And then, of course, I mean, when Free as a Bird came out, I think that anyone who was slightly older, perhaps like myself and perhaps like you two gentlemen, thought, well, that's interesting, but it's not very good. But if you speak to people who are a generation younger, there's a kind of, they fetishized it because it was a record by the Beatles. So by dint of that, it was good.
It's hard to believe.
These are
crazy, right?
I know.
These are the ELO generation that we've
That's right.
had to,
Yeah. It must be good because it sounds like ELO.
It sounds like ELO. ELO are their Beatles. That's how
They
that's
are.
their little portal, their gateway. It's
There's
really interesting.
hundreds of these people out
I know.
there. It's absolutely extraordinary. So look, there's the book, which we've only just skimmed the surface of some of the topics that are in there. Highly readable, and you're no doubt going to want to acquaint yourself with it. Faster Than a Cannonball, 1995 and all that, by Dylan Jones. Dylan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed.
Fantastic.
Huge
Lovely to
pleasure.
see you.
Thank you.